How's everybody doing? Good, good, good. So we are at we're at the end of our Legend of Joe Jacobson series, and I hope it's been fun, and I hope that we've discovered some things about Joseph in the pits and in the dungeons that can help us kind of walk each day believing, even when it's hard to see that God is with us, right? That's kind of been the phrase that's kind of held this thing together. And so if you haven't been with us, we've been talking about Joseph. And so what happened was Joseph was a 17-year-old, bit of a misfit. His dad liked him more than everybody else, and so more than all his other brothers. And so they did what brothers do. They threw him in a pit and sold him into slavery, right? But they didn't kill him, right? Because Judah was like, let's not kill him because he's our brother. Let's just sell him into slavery. So they sell him into slavery, and then it works good for him, right? He ends up at Potiphar's house, and he's really running things there, doing well, putting his best foot forward, making everything work out as best as it can, right? Believing that God was with him, so he ends up at the head of Potiphar's household, and then Mrs. Potiphar finds him charming and adorable, and she tries to seduce him. Joseph says, I'm not into that. I'm gonna, be about my God, and you're my master's wife. And he said, I can do anything I want in this household. I'm just not allowed to have you. You're the only thing he's held from me, right? And so she cries rape, and he's thrown into prison. But he puts his best foot forward in prison, right? And remember what they said is like, and Joseph found favor with the warden, right? That's my favorite phrase in that, and God was with him, right? That's my favorite phrase in the whole story. It's like, I don't want to know the warden. That's not favor. And so remember, but he makes it. He does all right, and then the cupbearer and the baker, poor baker, we won't get into the baker, but the cupbearer, he gets a good information from Joseph, and Joseph tells him about his dream. He's going to be restored, and he goes, but remember me, please, when you get there. Just let him know. And he does, right? 2 years later, right? He tells him, Pharaoh has a dream, and Pharaoh's going, I need someone to tell me what this dream means, and the baker's like, or not, the cupbearer says, I remember Joseph. And so they go get Joseph, and he tells him his dream, right, and all this, and so this is what we were left with. This is the passage that we left on in Genesis chapter 41. So we're going to try to cover 9 chapters, all right? We're not reading all of it, right? So if you're following in your Bible, it's going to be a little tough, but it's Genesis 41 through 50, all right, is what we're going to try to cover. So it says here in verse 39, then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known, talking about his dreams, right, made all of this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, this is verse 39, since made all this known to you, you shall be in charge of my palace, all my people submit to you, only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So, remember the astonished thing about this story, right, is that there's this phrase that keeps coming up, and I already said it, but it's the Lord was with Joseph. God was with Joseph in the pit when he was left by Judah. God was with Joseph in the dungeon. He was with Joseph at Potiphar's house. God is with him, and what we've asked ourselves is, what would life look like if not only we believed that God was with us, but that we acted as if God was with us, right? That God was for us, that everything that we felt called to do, that we did it with such confidence, believing that if God is for me, right, who could be against me? And so he told the truth. He acted uprightly. He put his best foot forward. He doesn't give up. He made the best of every situation that he had. And ultimately, that's all we can do, right? I mean, what else can you do but put forth the right efforts? And so we're going to act in our own lives as if God is with us, all right? So verse 46, it says this, Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So he's been there 13 years, right? 13 years he's been there. And so Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. And during the 7 years of abundance, and that was the dream was that there was going to be 7 years of abundance in Egypt, followed by 7 years of famine. All right, and so he put Joseph in charge. And so it says, during the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city, he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. And the 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. And when all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food, and then Pharaoh told the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph and do what he tells you." And so there's a bit of an economic lesson, right, in there, that it's something like, and we've talked a lot about this with a lot of the other Old Testament stories we're talking about, this idea of right sacrifice, of doing the right thing in the moment, even when it doesn't feel great, and so a lot of times when there's abundance in life, right, we talked a lot about the pit, right, we talked a lot about the dungeon and him in slavery with Potiphar, but when you're on top, right, when things are going well for you, and I hope there's some people here that things are going well for you, that it doesn't mean to enjoy every single bit of it, every single bit of the things that are going well, that there's this idea of storing some of it up, right, for a difficult time. And that's what Joseph is doing, right? He's going, okay, so because we have a tendency when things go well to just forget that they won't always go well, right? That eventually, listen, you're going to experience downtimes. And so whether it's finances or relationally, whatever, or at work, like you should always be, if you can, investing, whether it's time, money, or energy into these things, even when they're going well. That way, when things come, and they will, you're ready, right? You're prepared, and that's what Joseph was doing. Joseph's like, we're going to be prepared. So even though there's so abundant, we could just throw all the parties, we could have all the food, we get so fat and just love it all, right? But he's going, no, we've got to be prepared. So, but what's the other side of that mentality? It's always thinking calamities on the other side, right? Because we all know people, I think Dave Ramsey calls them free spirits and the nerds, right? And so the free spirit's like, spend, right? Just spend it. We got it, let's spend it, right? And then he says the nerd side is like, well, you never know. You never know what's going to happen tomorrow. You never know, right? And so you kind of have to manage the tension, right, between the two, because what does the Bible says about the other side? He says in Proverbs, he says, the name of the Lord is a fortified tower. The righteous run to it and are safe. But look at verse 11. It says, the wealth of the rich is their fortified city. They imagine it a wall too high to scale. And so the other side is that, listen, you could build and build and build and build and build. And I think just in the last 20 years, we found that those things can come crashing down, right? That your wall that you're trying to build, this fortified city that you're trying to build, is scalable. That those walls can be scaled. And so we have to manage that tension. It's the management of use what we have, invest, give, right? We should be giving when things are going well, investing, saving. And at the other side, also understand that you can't just always live in fear of what's to come. All right, so that's a little bit of the economic lesson of Joseph. So chapter 42, it says this. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, right? So Jacob is Joseph's dad, right? The Joe Jacobson, right? So he said, why do you keep, he's talking to his kids, he says, why do you keep looking at each other? I just imagine him just kind of hanging out like, man, this really stinks. We're really hungry. And that's like, do something, right? Do something about it. So he said, I've heard there's grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die. Like, he's like, it'd be cool if we ate. You know what I mean? So verse 3 says, then 10 of Joseph's brothers, right, went down. So we know Joseph is one of the 12, so 10, so they're leaving one behind, right? And so although Joseph, look at this, verse 8, it says, although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. And then he remembered his dream about them and said to them, you are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected. And they're like, no, my Lord, they answered, your servants have come to buy food. We are all the sons of one man. Your servants are honest men, not spies. No, he said to them, you've come to see where our land is unprotected. He has to be just giggling, and he just has to be loving this, right? There's part of him. But they replied, your servants were 12 brothers, the sons of one man who live in the land of Canaan. The youngest is now with our father, and one is no more. And Joseph said to them, it is just as I told you. You are spies, and this is how you will be tested. As surely as Pharaoh lives, you will not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of your numbers to get your brother. The rest of you will be kept in prison so that your words may be tested to see if you are telling the truth. And if you are not, then surely as Pharaoh lives, you are spies. And he put them all in custody for 3 days. He's given it to them a little bit, right? He's not selling them into slavery, or throwing them in a pit, but he's given it to them. And so at verse 19, it says, if you're honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison. So he's lowering the bar here a little bit. While the rest of you go and take grain back for your starving households. But you must bring your youngest brother to me so that your words may be verified and that you may not die. And this they proceeded to do. And they said to one another, surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen, and that's why this distress has come upon us. And we said 2 weeks ago, you don't get away with anything, right? That you want to bend the fabric of reality, that eventually it snaps back. And so for 17 years, right, or 13 years, they've been living, knowing what they did, and living with that. And I just wonder, how often did something come up in their lives and they go, we deserve this. I did this back then and I'm paying for it now. We do that to ourselves sometimes, right? We go, what did I do to deserve this? What did I, and we kind of heap some, and you can live under that. And these guys did, because they weren't forthright with what had happened in their lives. And so you live under that weight. And they lived under it and lived under it. And so there's a lot of back and forth. If you know the story, like I said, there's 5 chapters we're going to kind of skip through. But there's a back and forth. And so eventually the brothers, they go back to dad, and they bring Benjamin back. All right? And it says this in verse 29. It says, as Joseph looked about and saw his brother Benjamin. Right? And this is his only younger brother. And this is the one of the brothers of the wife that Jacob liked most. And again, that's, you don't want a wife that you like most. You just want one. But this is where we're at. So he said, God be gracious to you, my son. Deeply moved at the sight of his brother, Joseph hurried out and looked for a place to weep. He went into his private room and wept there. And after he had washed his face, he came out and, controlling himself, said, serve the food. And let's check this out. It says they served him by himself, the brothers by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat with Hebrews, for it's detestable. But verse 33 says, then the men had been seated before me in order of their ages, from the firstborn to the youngest, and they looked at each other in astonishment, like, wait, what is going on? How would they know who is the oldest, where we sit in order? And it says, then when the portions were served to them from Joseph's table, Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as anyone else's. And so they feasted and drank freely with him. And so he's screwing with them still. He's kind of giving it to them. But don't they deserve it? Isn't that when you're looking at Joseph, you're going, get yours. Right? There's a part of that in you where you're going, I get what you're feeling. I get what you're doing, right? And so actually when we're in a position, and we're going to see what Joseph does here in the near future, but when we're in a position of authority, or in a position that we've been hoping to be in. Because how often was Joseph maybe in the dungeon or working for Potiphar, where he's going, I remember that dream I had where all my family was bowing down to me, right? And he's like, and I'm really good with dreams. I figured that part out, right? So I think this is going to, and just kind of waiting for this moment. And now here they are, and he could put him in prison. He could have him killed. He could have him thrown into a pit. He is in charge of the world. Egypt is the number one nation in the world, and he is the number two guy. He could do whatever he wants to do to them. And so he doesn't do as bad as what they were doing to him, but he is screwing with them a little bit. And he's not done. He's not done. He's going to go one further. And so in Genesis chapter 44, verse 27, it says this. So real quick before we get to that. So what happened was they sent them back, all of them. He just sent them all back. All right, go back to your father, you know. You got grain, you got food, you got everything you want. And what Joseph does, he takes his personal chalice, right, his drinking cup, and he hides it in Benjamin's bag, right? So he hides it in Benjamin's bag, and he sends them all off. And then as they're leaving, he has someone go check their bags, right? Check their bags. I'm missing my chalice. And so they find it in Benjamin's bag, and he says, Benjamin's staying. The one your father loves the most, I'm keeping him, and he is stuck here in prison with me. I feel like he's planned, I feel like he might have thought a long time about how this was going to go down. You know what I mean? He had a lot of time. But look at this, and I wonder how stunned Joseph was. In Genesis 44:27, this is Judah speaking. It says, your servant, my father, said to us, you know that my wife bore me 2 sons. One of them went away from me, and I said, he has surely been torn to pieces, talking about Joseph, and I have not seen him since. If you take this one from me too, and harm comes to him, you will bring my gray head down to the grave in misery. So now, if the boy is not with us when I go back to your servant, my father, and if my father, whose life is closely bound up with that boy's life, sees that the boy isn't there, he will die. Your servants will bring the gray head of our father down to the grave in sorrow. Your servant guaranteed the boy's safety to my father. I said, if I do not bring him back to you, I will bear the blame before you, my father, all of my life. And now then, please let your servant remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return to his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? No, do not let me see the misery that would come on my father. He's come a long way in 20 years. I imagine Joseph had to be astonished to some degree. Where was this Judah when I was in the pit? You know? Where was this Judah when I needed somebody? Instead of just kind of trying to play, remember, he's trying to play both sides. He's like, well, I'll leave him in the pit, and then I'll circle around, I'll get him out. Like, where'd this guy come from, this Judah that's willing to sacrifice his own life for his brother, right? Listen, Judah clearly has been wrestling with what he did for a long time, right? It was his first place that he came. He's like, this is what we're getting. This is what we deserve. This is how it goes. We deserve this, right? That was his first inclination, because it's on his heart. It's on his mind. I mean, he's in Egypt. He knows he was sold to Egypt, right? So there's all this this grossness that he's hanging on to. But at some point in the 20 years, Judah chose to allow that pain to transform him into something better, right? That he didn't stay as that young 20-something Judah, but he became somebody that was astonishing, that was doing something that no one thought he would do. He was finally taking the role that he was meant to be, and he was sticking up for his brother. And I imagine he's just thinking about all the pain he's already caused his dad. Right? And he's like, we're not we're not doing it again. And so the lesson is what? It's like, don't let your past failures stop you from being who God created you to be. Whatever you've done, understand that God forgives you, right? He hasn't given up on you, and so you shouldn't give up on you, right? That you have something to offer, and to stop letting that kind of weigh down on you. Listen, there's a passage in Romans 8. It says this. It says, therefore, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Because through Christ, Jesus saw the law of the Spirit who gives life has set you free from the law of sin and death. And so it's like at some point you have to stop beating yourself up. And that's what he's going to with Judah. It's like, Judah, yeah, you screwed up royally, and 15 years later, it's like there's really no fixing that. So what are you going to do? You've got to accept the grace that's offered to you. You've got to live within it, because otherwise it just buries you and it holds you captive, right? That's why it's called being set free, because you're captive to it until you move past it. And John 8:36 says, so if the Son has set you free, you are free indeed. And so you are free from the guilt to start living like God is for you, right? All right, Genesis 45. We're moving through. Then Joseph could no longer control himself, and before all his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. And so there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers, and he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him. Right? So Judah's speech just moved him to tears. He just go, I can't be angry anymore. I can't be upset. I can't be vindictive. I can't play these games with you anymore, right? Judah's honesty about how he feels about his dad, and you can see what's come through about how he feels about Joseph, right? That it just breaks him. And so it says, and he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified, right? It's like, I bet. And verse 4 says, then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here. Because, check this, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing or reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. See, when you're on top and you got the hammer, right? You can do whatever you want. Sometimes acting as if God is for you is understanding the big picture. Listen, that takes a lot to be like Joseph, right? If you haven't been sitting here, if you've been here all 3 weeks and you're sitting here going, we're supposed to be like Joseph? Like, I don't know. Right? Because listen, his brothers can't believe it, because what happens is, so there's that moment, and then like 5 chapters later, which is actually a lot of time that span, Jacob dies. Okay? So Jacob dies, and now his brothers are going, okay, he was being nice to us while Dad was alive. Now what? Right? Now what? Now surely he's going to bring the hammer. Now surely he's going to have us thrown in prison. Genesis 50. Verse 15, it says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. You know this is bull crap, right? This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of God your Father. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. Because he knew. They were afraid, right? They were afraid. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. And Joseph could have just been like, yep. He said, don't be afraid. Check this. Am I in the place of God? That's a good word. That's a good thing to remember. It's a good question to ask. When we want to pass judgment, when we want to bring the hammer down, we want to leverage or levy something against someone, it's, am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he assured them and spoke kindly to them. So what do we do with the story? Again, because here's what we tend to do. And so let me offer some grace to us in this moment. A lot of times in the Bible stories, what we like to do as readers is we like to place ourselves in this place of the hero. Right? It's like if we're reading David and Goliath, it's always like, you're David, and you're going to fight that giant, and you're going to, it's always that kind of thing, right? We are not Joseph in this story. We're not Joseph. But sometimes we're Judah, right? Where we try to play the game and try to get what we want and not put people off and try to bend reality and lie to get what we want. Like sometimes we're Judah. Sometimes we're Mrs. Potiphar. Trying to just get pleasure out of this life at the cost of anything. That it doesn't matter what's in front of us, that all that matters is me right now. Sometimes we're selfish and we just cast people aside and use them for our own benefit. Sometimes we're the cupbearer, where we go, oh, thank you, Joseph, and then completely forget to give him thanks when it matters and to lift him up and to give him praise. You see how we these are the roles that we play in a lot of these things. And so for Joseph, listen, Joseph is a foreshadowing of what is to come in Jesus. Right? Because who takes the sin of Judah? It's Joseph. Joseph pays the price for what Judah did. And then who pays the price for Mrs. Potiphar? Joseph pays the price for what Mrs. Potiphar did. And then who's the one that takes the sin of being forgotten by the cupbearer? It's Joseph. See, what happens is we live a life so often of being in these other positions, and we don't nail it. And the beautiful thing is that we're offered grace in all of it. That we still have an opportunity to step up, and we still have, that Judah still has the opportunity to show up and to grow. Like, who knows what happens to Potiphar's wife? But it was grace, because at any time Joseph could have come back through and go, no, she was lying, right? He could have come back through and said, nope, she's gone. Oh, that your cupbearer, get him out of here. Like, I'm in charge now, right? All these people messed with me. But Jesus is a better Joseph, because he lives an even more perfect life. He takes on even more sin than Joseph did, the sins of the entire world, past, present, future. And even when he's hanging on a cross, what does he say? Luke 23:34, Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. See, the ironic thing in this story, is that we're called, and this may be the only time I would ever say this in Old Testament discussion, I think we're called to be like Pharaoh. What does he say? Remember what we read at first? Genesis 41, verse 8. So Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? And so Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. And then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. And he dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. It's like that's who we are supposed to be. It's like, hey, Jesus, here's my signet ring. Here's all control of my land. Here's control of my entire life. Like all these other people that knew Joseph, all these other people in their lives, and here's the guy that's in charge of the whole land. He's going, you've got the wisdom, right? It's like when Peter said to Jesus, when Jesus said to Peter, hey, are you going to leave? Remember, Peter says, where am I going to go? You have the words of life, right? You're the Messiah, the Savior of the world, right? It's like Jesus is a better king. And so we offer up our lives to the one who died for them, who took all the sins that we should have had and said, you don't have to pay for them. I did. So live your life as if God is for you. Right? Blessings, church.